former State Senator Frank Antonori raised an intriguing possibility in the battle that's now underway about education funding in Arizona. As you may know, a judge has ordered the state of Arizona to cough up $317 million in inflationary adjustments that the legislature had foregone starting in 2010 in defiance of a voter-passed mandate that was passed several years ago. Judges said, no, it was not. You didn't have the authority to do that. You got to make those payments. And there's now a hearing underway, or will be underway soon, about whether we should also have to pay $1.3 billion in back payments. There's an offer on the table from educators saying, State of Arizona, pay us the $317 million now that the judge has said that you owe us, and we will give up our claim to the $1.3 billion. So the state's got to decide whether to appeal the judge's ruling and then run the risk of having to pay $1.6 billion, take the settlement and pay the $317 million, or there's the third option, which Republican Frank Antonori, former state senator, floated on our show last week. He says the possibility exists, and he didn't say how likely it was, and he didn't say he endorsed it, but he says the possibility exists that the state could simply ignore a judge's ruling if it loses the appeal. So I thought it'd be great to get a legal opinion on that, and we have Arizona State Attorney General Tom Horne on the line. Attorney General Horne, thank you so much for joining us. I understand you're driving cross-country right now, and cell phone reception may be spotty.
It's good to be with you.
I really appreciate you participating. So, Attorney General Horne, what do you think about that idea? Is it conceivable? Is it even possible that the state legislature and or the governor, because they would both have to be in on it, but would it be possible for both of them to simply ignore a judge's ruling, and what would be the consequences of that?
In the long run, I don't think it's feasible to ignore a judge's ruling. I went through this once before when a federal judge ordered us to spend more money on English language learners, and I fought that in court. And the legislature was saying, the leadership of the legislature was saying they were not going to pay it whether we won or lost. And I was saying, if we lose, I think you're going to have to pay it.
Yeah.
But I fought it out, and we actually won that and got it reversed. So that was a major victory. That case is called Horne versus Flores.
Right.
Because I was the appellant in the U.S. Supreme Court, and at that time, Terry Goddard and Janet Napolitano were filing briefs against me, but as I was at that time the superintendent of schools, but I won that case.
So having won it, but you said there were...
But we researched it.
Yeah, so there were people...
ultimately, as a last resort, the courts have the ability to hold legislative leadership, the governor and others in contempt and impose punishments on them. It has to be a last resort. The courts don't approve doing that lightly, but ultimately they have the ability to do that.
Right. So
and the other thing is, ultimately, I think the winner of a contest like that is the one that the public is, on whose side the public is.
Right.
The public opinion ultimately determines these things, and if you have a legislature going against a court, the public is going to go with the court. So I don't believe that it's possible to ignore a court ruling. You can appeal it and fight it out, as I did in the Flores case, all the way to the United States Supreme Court. But if they don't take the case or they rule against you, ultimately you're going to have to, I believe you're going to have to obey what the courts say.
Now, you said that some people were floating the idea in the case you just cited of maybe at some point down the line, if the ruling was adverse, just ignoring it. What kind of advice were you giving them? I mean, I presume you were telling them what you just told me, not to do it.
Yeah. No, I was telling them you've got to obey court orders. You can fight them, you can appeal, you can argue in court, but you can't defy them. Ultimately, we're a country of laws, and even legislators and governors have to follow the laws as determined by the courts. If you think the courts are overreaching, then you appeal to a higher court. But if the higher courts won't take the case or rule against you, then then I think sooner or later you're going to comply.
Right. Now,
it might be because of public opinion, it might be because of punishments that are imposed, but sooner or later you're going to comply.
One of the things that made this intriguing in this conversation is because the stakes are so high, and if the state goes forward with an appeal and we lose, we could wind up facing a $1.6 billion debt that we owe that a judge is telling us we have to pay, and with no immediate way to actually cough up that money without some pretty painful measures. And that's why this came up in the conversation. And former Senator Antonori said, the governor, the courts don't control the state police. The governor does that. So if a judge orders somebody held in contempt I mean, his implication was, who's going to actually carry out that order if the governor doesn't agree to have that happen? Do you see something like that having the ability?
The police would obey the courts.
I'm sorry, say again?
I believe the police would obey the courts.
You think they would?
I believe the psyche of Americans is that you obey the courts. You can appeal it, you can fight it, but if you lose and the court makes a decision, just like if you win, you expect the laws to be enforced by the courts. But if you lose, you have to obey the courts. I believe that ultimately is what ends up happening.
This is why, in this conversation, we were discussing this. Mr. Antonori uses the phrase constitutional crisis, because he foresaw a scenario where somebody, say it's a police officer, a state police officer, whomever, there's a judge's ruling there that says go arrest somebody for contempt, but then maybe you have a scenario where the governor's saying don't do that. Police officer reports to the governor, not the courts. That creates a strange situation. You think the police officer would obey the courts in that situation?
I believe they would. Yeah, I think that's the American frame of mind, is that the law is ultimately, it's passed by the legislature, it's enforced by the governor, but it's the interpretation of the courts that counts.
Interesting. We also talked about another scenario in which I presume there'd be, if somebody's got to pay $1.6 billion, somebody's going to have to write that check, cut that money order, whatever it is. And that official, again, reports out through the administrative branch. So if the governor is saying don't do it, and the court is saying do it, who does that person obey? Same scenario? Well,
the state treasurer is independently elected and does not answer to the governor.
All right.
The state treasurer would make the check.
Okay, so you see very little possibility that something like this could actually happen then, and what I'm hearing you say is don't worry about it. Has anybody from the state actually floated this idea past you?
Yeah, and as I say, I went through the whole cycle in the Flores case, where the legislature was to fine the court, and they were fining us $2 million a day. Had I not won that case, we would have been liable for $300 million.
That's a lot of money. Are you able to reveal who actually asked you?
Yeah, I have been through this, but I just believe I'm not saying there won't be a crisis. There could be a crisis,
right.
But I think at the end it's the court that is going to prevail, partly because that's the frame of mind of, for example, the police, and partly because that's where public opinion is going to be.
Right. Now, are you able?
No politician is going to defy public opinion for long. Now,
I want to make sure that I heard you correctly. So, somebody actually did float this idea by you in this case, in the case we're talking about, the $307 million and the $1.3 billion and all that is going on right now.
Well, in both cases, really, I haven't had extensive discussions about in this case the way I did in the Flores case. In the Flores case, I'd had extensive discussions with legislative leadership, but they were determined not to follow the court decision. I was very worried about it. But
right.
Since I won the case, it didn't come to fruition.
Okay. In the current case, are you able to reveal, given your position and attorney-client privilege and all that fun stuff, who asked you about this?
No, I can't. Obviously, I can't talk about that.
Sure. All right. So, but I'm guessing now you haven't been asked then to render an official opinion about this. You haven't been asked to render an attorney general's official written opinion. I certainly haven't heard about that. I assume there's nothing in writing on this.
I have not been asked to do that. That's correct.
One of the things I found in my research is that there's actually some recent precedent for this, where the Oklahoma governor not too long ago was under an injunction. I guess it was a stay of execution that had been issued by the Oklahoma Supreme Court. But that court has two branches. One is civil, and the one that issued the stay was the civil side, and she simply ignored it. She simply said, I don't think you have any authority over me, and I'm not going to follow this. And she didn't, and she actually made it stick. She made the court back down. There's no parallel process here in Arizona to that, but I think you've been pretty clear so far in saying, even though some people are fantasizing about it, you just don't see that playing out, and you certainly would not advise, as the Attorney General of the state of Arizona, for anybody to follow that course of action.
No, I think once you get a court decision, you have to obey it. If the court in Oklahoma back down, then that's a valid result if they decide to back down, or if another court overrules them.
Right. After
in the long run,
yeah.
The final determination is by the courts. I think that that we saw that in the Nixon impeachment case. We saw that where he wanted to withhold records, and they told him to produce the records, and he did.
Right.
We saw that in the case of Bush versus Gore, where they decided who was going to win the presidential election. Gore had more votes, but the Supreme Court said that Bush was going to win Florida and therefore was going to win the Electoral College, and everybody followed it. We have a long tradition of over 200 years of taking our Constitution very seriously, and I think in the long run, people will do what the courts decide.
Yeah, okay. I hope you're right, because I certainly hate to see the kind of constitutional crisis we were sort of discussing last week. It's a pretty scary scenario.
It is, and I'm not saying that constitutional crisis won't happen. We may have a constitutional crisis. I'm just saying if we have a constitutional crisis, in the end, it's the courts that will prevail.
Right. We'll resolve it by doing what the judge says.
And the public will support the courts.
Okay. Last question. Do you have a best guess as to how this scenario might play out? Do you think there'll be an appeal? Do you think we'll take a settlement? Do you have any judgment on that?
I don't know. I can't give you a sensible answer to that.
All right. Attorney General Tom Horne, I really appreciate you taking some time out and talking with us today. I know you're traveling cross country, so I appreciate you taking a moment to speak with us, and thank you very much.
Pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure to have you. Thank you so much. All right, well, there you heard it. The Attorney General of the state of Arizona says, this idea actually has been floated, but that he shot it down as quickly as he could. The idea that if a judge says the state of Arizona has to pay $317 million or an additional $1.3 billion, that, we'd have to find a way to comply with that. It would not be lawful, and it would not be a good idea to simply ignore it. So the idea apparently has been taken seriously enough to where at least one of our legislative leaders, he wasn't willing and able ethically to say who, but somebody had actually floated that balloon by him, and he popped it as quick as he could. He said, "Nope, don't even think about it. Don't go there. If a judge rules, we will have to comply with those rulings." And as you heard him say, that idea actually came up in a previous case where the stakes were kind of similar, and he said the same thing. He said, "No, we're going to follow this case as far as we can. Win or lose, we'll do we'll do what's appropriate, and we'll do what's proper, and that does not include simply ignoring a judge's order." So, last week, as I was saying at the beginning of the conversation, you heard former Senator Frank Antonori raise that as a possibility. Did not predict it, did not say it was likely to happen, simply said that, it's an idea that's out there, but he certainly didn't say that he endorsed it. And so it'll be very interesting to see what plays out. We'll have to, I suppose we'll know pretty soon whether the state decides to appeal the judge's order and fight the order to pay the $317 million in inflationary adjustments that are due right now, according to this voter-passed mandate that was passed several years ago. And then also whether the judge piles on top of that an additional $1.3 billion in back pay, or whether the state decides to appeal. And then if the state does decide to appeal, instead of taking the offer that's on the table right now, it could wind up facing the whole $1.6 billion enchilada. But whatever happens, the state attorney general, Tom Horne, says, no, we have to follow the judge's ruling. So everybody ought to keep that in mind as they decide what to do now. And we are at that crossroads now, where the state has to decide whether to appeal or whether to take the settlement. Pay $317 million now and walk away from it, or run the risk of having to pay $1.6 billion. And if you think 317 would stress our budget and make our deficit problems worse, can you just imagine what $1.6, $1.7 billion would do to us? So our state